Your confidence is that Knesset is not going to fall apart warms my heart, but one of those things, this coalition, for example, is totally far-fetched. And I keep hear the members of the coalition themselves saying that it is somewhat surreal, impossible, and one of the things that gets stuck with, and one of the things they're sticking themselves with, is something that they've called erroneously governance. In other words, trying to distance the Arab members of Knesset from the Knesset by elevating the threshold, the voting level. And so I think that they ought to perhaps hold back their expressions that they use in the actual Knesset and their interpellations. And as you perhaps noticed, by the way, are you called here Brigadier General? After all, you're sitting in civilian clothes here. One of the things that you said, and perhaps those who have really astute listening capabilities, that since I think it was 1963, our whole national security concept has not changed, and I think that it's a bit difficult if you think about really things. It has changed. We have new threats. After all, we heard about them very extensively from the commander of Intel, and I think maybe he wanted to panic the public, which was good because they did panic. And another thing, that is their role, is very often to frighten the public as much as possible, not only to keep them up on their toes and awake, but also to keep that option available to achieve whatever they need for their security system, defense system, so that we'll be able to defend those the issues. It sounds as if I'm saying this sarcastically, but actually I'm not. The threats have changed. We've got peace accords that since 1953, 1963, there are all sorts of agreements, peace accords that have been attained. For example, the commander of Intel, of military intelligence, when he spoke this morning, he devoted plenty of time today. That's a weakening of various factors, the shake-up of the Arab world, the turmoil. And of course, the most significant thing that has changed, ladies and gentlemen, that is Israeli society. Israeli society has undergone a very deep, significant change with additional issues that have changed the economy, that has created the social gaps. They had a detrimental effect on the economy, had a detrimental effect on our society. So how come with all these changes, inwardly, outwardly, our security, national security concept has not changed? Good health, bless you, to someone who sneezed, she just said. Now, I'd just like to talk about a number of things that do complement each other. One of them, I will start with what Mr. Gedi Greenstein said. He formulated fantastically what is national in our security. Which security who are we talking about? What is security? Are we talking about personal security? Because personal security is comprised of physical security on a level that I won't be run over on the road, that I won't be murdered, or that I won't be raped. And I know that you are an audience that is not an expertise on rape, but for a very, very high percentage of our population is actually under that threat the entire time. And that does not exist because they are under that threat the whole time. And for example, is there employment security? And another thing that's deteriorating here in Israel is nutrition security, food. Those who actually have been awarded that they have enough to eat, and not even talking about the things that they should be eating. All that is not included in that definition of security. And I'd like to remind you of what Nadia Chilu said, that one of the things that worries the Arabs in Israel, the Israeli Arabs, is their lack of national security, because the policemen do not intervene into what is happening within their communities, and because the state conducts itself, I will say cautiously, let's say more sort of swiftly, impulsively about issues that are connected to dignity, honor in those communities that should be, by the way, anchored constitutionally. And all those issues that I mentioned, the impoverished, the female and male Arabs, men and women, gender issues in general, all those do not participate in the security deliberations. Now again, let me go a little further. To which degree is the exclusivity of the discussions on security? We're talking about people in the army, previously served in the army, and from that, it is so exclusive. To a certain degree, about a week ago, perhaps those who read Haaretz read that there's a bill proposal that they're going to enhance the supervision of the Security Committee in the Knesset, the Defense Committee, on what is happening in the security institutions in Israel. So if someone asks for specific information, do all the subcommittees, are they allowed to ask it and audit these things, or can they just come and make a surprise visit, for example, in prisons, for example, all sorts of little issues like that. The entire defense system, and of course, immediately people were up on their hind legs. One would have thought that it is the Minister of Defense who immediately stood on his hind leg, that they would object to that kind of thing. After all, shouldn't it be transparent, especially to the committee in the Knesset that is responsible for that kind of thing? But one of the senior officials said, what? Every senior commander or senior person would be allowed to go and visit any of the most classified units suddenly out of the blue? I would have thought that it was natural. We talk in an exclusive language, for example, in the army. We all know that, don't we? I sometimes feel, both men and women know that, they actually very often speak like a doctor who speak doctor's language, medicalese, when they speak beside a patient's bed. But we have to remember, we are not the patients. This security is ours, no less than any other people who are supposed to be enjoying it. And I'm deliberately only using at the moment only the masculine in Hebrew because it is exclusive to the masculine, especially when it comes to making decisions about these issues, and not to females in the State of Israel. Now, if you talk about national security concept, it should be leaning on peace. Whose peace? I think that our number one security issue that has proven itself with all the peace accords that we have actually signed. But does that actually support the interests of our defense system? I'm just throwing that up in the air because, after all, my time is running out. We spoke about 12 minutes, so I will keep my 12 minutes. One ought to ask ourselves that when you talk about doctors who speak about a patient's bed, after we're mentioning that, by the way, they're cutting back in the State of Israel on all health issues while they are adding more and more and padding the defense system, and they're cutting back on medication, doctors and nurses. But instead, after all, we have to think about what Bogi spoke about, how each field actually creates its gatekeepers because of our human nature. Then we ought to immediately ask, is that the main interest? Peace? Is that the main interest of our defense system? And after all, we're talking about a great deal of money and other people around the world. But now I would like to move on to the second reason. The second reason that was actually mentioned here by Mr. Yadlin in the previous panel on Iran and the trauma. The State of Israel refuses, we as a unit, as an entity, as a nation, not as a Jewish nation, because, for example, the Jews in the States do not suffer from that trauma, but in Israel they have refused to concede their trauma of the Holocaust, and it molds our entire policy. We are not willing to cede our position as victims. We run this kind of struggle and competition about who is more of a victim and who is more right about issues. When we're talking about the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, who just stood here at this podium and said we will not have peace. Maximum, we might reach some kind of arrangement. But peace? Don't talk to me about peace. There is a reason that we talk here about rounds. We might actually distance the next round of military issues. But it was said here we might not be able to take advantage of warning deterrence in order to reach some kind of arrangement, some kind of peace agreement. Wars should be a tool in order to create a situation that is better, through which we can reach some kind of permanent status agreement that would have peace reigning here. But no, not in Israel. We sit entrenched in our trenches with our rifles and the targets, waiting for the next round. That's what happens here. Very often it's acceptable to say, what would have happened had we signed a peace accord with Syria? Now look what's happening. Look what could have happened. Had we signed an agreement with Syria, then it's very possible that what is happening in Syria would not have been happening. But we're not going to now deal about what would have happened if. But I would like to conclude, of course, I'm going to conclude by saying that this trauma that runs and manages us is partially real and deeply set, that we do need to grapple with at some point and overcome. But part of it is used cynically for political reasons to achieve clout. They're actually exploiting those fears to explain the reason that we do not have this true security. And for this exploitation that detrimentally affects each and every one's security and the general security of the State of Israel, against this exploitation, we need to start actually countering and fighting against and not against.